Hello, New Prospect. Welcome to RTB 2021 for August the 17th, 2021. Hope you're doing well on this day. So our text for today, we've got 1 Samuel 9, pretty significant text in the book of 1 Samuel. We have Romans 7, one of the more complex texts in the book of Romans, if not in the entire New Testament, one of the most debated ones, at least, I guess you could say. And then we have Jeremiah 46 and then Psalm 22, probably one of the most amazing texts in the entirety of the Old Testament. So let's deal with each of these. Remember that we've talked about Romans 7 and Psalm 22 before, so we'll hit those a little bit more of a cursory manner than we normally would. So let's jump right in with 1 Samuel 9. So this is a really significant text, obviously, in the book of 1 Samuel, because this is where Saul is chosen as the first king in response to the request of the people, of course. A couple of things that's interesting about this section is Saul's reign is obviously being presented here, but it's being presented with a sense of foreboding. We see something of at least hints of Saul's incompetence and spiritual ignorance throughout this whole text, things that will become problematic as we go throughout the rest of the text. And of course, he is presented as one that has all appearances of being a king like the nations around them. He's taller than everybody else, he's handsome, these types of things, but appearances can be deceiving, can't they? David, in contrast, as we'll see in a few chapters, is one that is not distinguished by anything in terms of his physical appearance, but it's in his inner quality, which distinguishes him. And that's really what God is concerned about when it comes to his king, because as we read yesterday in Psalm 21, is the king who trusts in God. That's really what the main quality of the king should be. Well, a couple of other things of note about 1 Samuel 9 that's interesting. You'll notice at the chapter begins, and there was a certain man of Benjamin whose name was Kish. And so this phrase, there was a certain man of, it's the same phrase that's used all the way back sorry about that. Where is it? Here we go. In chapter 1, verse 1, to introduce the birth of Samuel. So there's this kind of contrast set up right from the beginning between Samuel and Saul. Samuel is set up to be almost the anti-Saul. Of course, David will be the ultimate anti-Saul. But even here, we're seeing Saul put in distinction, or is compared and contrasted with the good character that is Samuel. The other thing to notice is, of course, that you have this shepherd motif. Now, this will become very significant as we get to David, because, of course, David is a shepherd and a good shepherd, right? And the significance of that is, of course, that the shepherd imagery in the ancient Near East is kingly imagery, right? Kings were known as shepherds. It's not just in Israel, but also throughout the ancient Near East, the ancient world. They were known to be shepherds of their people. And so rightly here, we have Saul looking after his donkeys, but not of his father, but not in a very good way, right? They're lost. So it's kind of pointing in a very kind of in an ironic way, or I guess in a furtive way here, kind of secretive way, a precursor, I guess, of Saul's future failure to be a shepherd of his people. And again, in contrast to David, who would be the shepherd of his people. So some interesting things that are going on here. And of course, ultimately, Saul is identified by Samuel and is a bit shocked by Samuel's request to be the king, and yet this is the Lord's will. So that's 1 Samuel 9. Let's move on then to, we'll go over to Jeremiah 46. So in Jeremiah 46, this is beginning a section in Jeremiah that is, by the way, we're skipping 45. Remember that we did 45 along with another chapter earlier last week, I guess. But Jeremiah 46 through 51 are all focused on oracles of judgment on foreign nations. Now, this is fairly common in the prophetic books. We see this in Nahum and Obadiah, We see it in Isaiah. We've seen it already in Isaiah. We see it in Ezekiel. So these prophecies against foreign nations are all throughout the prophets. They have a couple of typical characteristics, though. They all focus typically on God's sovereignty and his right to judge the nations, which becomes a theme, frankly, for the entirety of the Bible. We see it a lot in the book of Psalms, and of course, we'll see it when we get to the book of Revelation as well. But also remember that these oracles are not intended for those nations. It's not as if God is sending these oracles to them in order to warn the nations of their impending judgment that's coming upon them, but this is intended for the people of God. Another bit of trivia about this particular section in Jeremiah is that actually, if you remember, there are two translations of the ancient translations of the Old Testament. We have, of course, the Hebrew Bible, but then around the time of Jesus and a couple of centuries before, Jews who lived in Alexandria in Egypt started translating the Hebrew Bible into Greek, and this is something known as the Septuagint. You'll often see it abbreviated to LXX. Well, in that Septuagint, this section is actually earlier in the book of Jeremiah, so it actually takes this whole section and moves it earlier. So this is probably a coherent section in the book of Jeremiah 46 through 51, all dealing with the prophecies against the foreign nations, and this one is specifically dealing with the prophecies against Egypt, and is focusing on two events: Egypt's defeat at the Battle of Carchemish in the year 605 BC. This was at the hands of the Babylonians. And there was a defeat of a pharaoh called Necho. And Pharaoh Necho was actually pretty significant in the history of Israel, because it was Necho who in 609 BC killed the last good king of Israel, and that was Josiah. And then this also speaks of Nebuchadnezzar's king of Babylon's later invasion of Egypt in about 17 years or so after the exile of Jerusalem, somewhere around 569 or 568 BC. So it's speaking of those defeats and also those events, and speaking of the ultimate doom of the Egyptians and the judgment that's going to come on the Egyptians. And another characteristic, by the way, is that each of these nations are judged based on how they have treated God's people. So that's another key characteristic of these. They're interesting to read through, and it's also interesting to kind of compare and contrast the oracles in, say, Jeremiah, and the oracles in Ezekiel or in Isaiah and other books. All right, let's move on we'll go on to Romans 7. We're heading in that direction. So Romans 7, again, as I mentioned, this is a very controversial text. It begins with Paul talking about the nature of the law and the role of the law, and talking about how the law is something that ultimately pointed him to Christ. And of course, it's not that the law itself, talking about the Torah, the law, it's not that the law itself is evil. It's that he himself was evil. The law itself is holy, and the commandment is holy and righteous and good. It's what the law produced within him and his sinful nature that was the problem, and that's always the problem. That's what Christ came to resolve. And then in verse 14, it begins a section which is probably one of the most debated texts in the book of Romans, and that is the text where Paul starts talking about how the things that he wants to do, he doesn't do, and it's because of the sin that dwells in him. He says, now I'm no longer the one doing it, but the sin that dwells in me, verse 17. For I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is my flesh. For the willing is present within me, but the doing of good is not. And the good that I want to do, I do not do, but I practice the very evil that I do not want to do. So the question is, when Paul talks like that, when he talks about, okay, I want to do these good things, but I can't do it because there's this sinful fleshly side of me. Is he talking about the battle within a Christian the battle to walk in holiness and to increase in our sanctification, the battle against the flesh of mortifying the flesh and killing off the sin in our life? Or is he talking about, in kind of a present tense way, looking back and talking about what it was like for him before he became a follower of Christ? Was he talking about the rule that the sin in his life had over him before he was a follower of Christ? Well, you will find good scholars on both sides of that issue. And at different points in times, I've been on both sides of that issue as well. Here's what I will say. I think that you can read it with application to both of those situations, and I think Paul probably would agree with that. And just to say that, obviously, before Christ, there is no power within us to resist the fleshly tendencies that are part of our fallen human nature. But at the same time, after we come to Christ, we're still we're not perfected. If we say that we have sinned, John tells us, we lie and the truth is not in us. So we're still battling against that old nature. So what we need then is a continual growth in holiness. Well, how do we initially overcome that sin nature, that fallen nature, and how do we initially get deliverance from that in salvation? And how do we continue to grow in our walk with Christ? And how do we continue to kill off sin in our life once we come to Christ? Well, the answer is in verse 25. Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. That's the way. We recognize the wretched man that we are, the wretched person that we are, verse 24, and that we need to be set free from this body of death. By the way, 24 seems to be Paul talking about himself before Christ, but again, there's debates over that. But at the very least, what we can say is that in either case, our deliverance is through Jesus Christ our Lord. He is the one who helps us to defeat sin initially, or not just helps us, he defeats sin initially within our fallen nature, and then he continues to help us to kill off or mortify the flesh once we come to Christ. So that's Romans 7. I probably didn't resolve any of the issues, but it's a good discussion to have. And then finally, Psalm 22. We've talked about Psalm 22 before. I preached on Psalm 22 before. It is a wonderful text which speaks of the work of Christ. I don't think you will find, other than Isaiah 53, you will not find a text that more clearly articulates the work that Jesus did on the cross for us than Psalm 22. It is a Psalm of David. It's a lament psalm, but it's the very psalm that was on the lips of Jesus even as he dies on the cross, because, of course, he quotes from Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? So one of the last 7 sayings of Jesus on the cross. And Psalm 22, therefore, is, I think, what he's meditating on the entirety of the psalm, even as he's on the cross. And then, of course, the gospel writers, when they go into writing their account of not just the crucifixion, but also the events leading up to the crucifixion, the trial and the mocking and the scourging of Jesus, they do so with language from Psalm 22 to purposely show how Jesus is fulfilling this particular psalm as the ultimate sufferer, as the righteous sufferer that the psalm predicts ultimately. You see also connections in the psalm to Isaiah 53 and that idea of a suffering king, a suffering servant, because of course, if this is a psalm of David, David was the king and he was suffering in this way, but not in he was suffering almost in a figurative way in some of the language that he uses here. What he suffers through figuratively, Jesus suffers through literally. For instance, in verse 16, they pierced my hands and feet. It doesn't happen to David literally, it's figuratively, right? But for Jesus, it happens literally. Same with the stripping of my garments and the dividing them by lots. The same thing as talking about the verse 15, which I think is referred to back in John 19:28, talking about Jesus thirsting. He says, my strength is dried up like a potsherd and my tongue cleaves to my jaws, as would happen if you're dying and you're battling dehydration. So this is a psalm that we read Christologically. We read seeing Jesus and seeing Jesus very clearly, even as the gospel writers did in the words of this particular psalm. So my encouragement to you as you read through it is see Jesus in this text, because that's what the New Testament writers do. But also, one last thing, and I know I've mentioned this before, I think when I first talked about this psalm, is that this is a lament psalm. And as is typical with lament psalms, they begin with questions, they begin with a complaint, but then they end with confidence. And this psalm is no different. It ends with confidence, for the kingdom is the Lord's and he rules over the nations. The ends of the earth will remember and return to the Lord. The families of the nations will worship before you. And then, of course, in verse 31, they will come and declare his righteousness to a people yet to be born, that he has performed it, that it is finished. So here's this confidence that God, through the suffering of this person, this king, will accomplish his purpose, and that the ends of the earth will see this and will come to God because of it. So even as Jesus, by meditating on this psalm, I think he's not only referring to the intensity of his suffering, as verse 1 points to, right? The suffering that only Jesus could experience, and the suffering that we cannot even imagine that Jesus was experiencing. As I've mentioned before, other people underwent crucifixion, but no one suffered like Jesus did. The infinite amount of sin being poured out, placed on an infinitely righteous Savior, resulting in the infinite justice of God being poured out upon an infinitely innocent person, an infinitely righteous sufferer in the person of Jesus. We can't even imagine the type of suffering he was going through. And yet, even while he was suffering, I think he had in his mind, by meditating on this psalm, the deliverance and the salvation that will come through that work. And so that's a great psalm to meditate on around Easter, but also really throughout the year, as we meditate on the great work that Jesus has done on our behalf. And so I hope that's your meditation this day, August 17th, 2021. I hope you have a great day, and hope you spend some time meditating on Jesus's gracious work on our behalf.